A few years back, I moved into a new apartment. I didn't have much furniture, so my friends offered me some furniture that they no longer used. It was a mirror-wardrobe combo. I said I only needed the mirror, since I already have dressers. I hung the mirror at the end of the entrance hallway. There was definitely something up with this mirror. Ever since I hung it up, I would get eerie feelings whenever I passed it, and I could swear that I could see weird things in it. But I figured I was just seeing things. One day, I came home from work and was emptying my keys and wallet from my pockets. I looked down the hall into the mirror, and there was somebody in the mirror standing behind me. It looked like a tall man. I lived alone at the time, and there was nobody behind me. Big nope. I have a friend who is into spirituality and stuff. I went outside and called her. She came over and covered the mirror and went all around and burned sage and splashed holy water and everything. We took that mirror, still covered, to the junkyard and just left it. I ended up calling my friend who gave me the mirror and asked them if anything weird had ever happened while they had owned it. They said they used to keep it and the wardrobe in their young son's room, but he kept complaining that the man who lived inside of it would come out and bother him at night. This story takes place around 3 years ago. I live in a very small town in rural Appalachia, southeast Kentucky, that is home to a lot of folklore, primarily around an area of my town called Westwood. To give a little backstory on the area and why it's such a hot spot, the hillside that Westwood sits on was a field hospital in the latter part of the Civil War, wherein Union and Confederate troops were treated in the same area. So the area is ripe with stories to tell. I dated a girl in high school that lived in Westwood, and being that my town's size altogether is a little over a mile, I used to walk to her house quite often. One night in November, we had decided that we were going to walk downtown just to get a little exercise. The path that leads into town was once a railway that used to go through downtown, but since I've been alive, that rail has since been ripped up and paved over to create the walking path. It's around 11:30 when we leave, and we spend a little time just sitting and talking in town before we decide to head back home. On the way back up to her house, we hear what sounds to be a bell ringing. We stop and listen, thinking that it was a flag bouncing off of the flagpole in the Confederate cemetery in Westwood. But then it hits me. The wind's not blowing. She comes to realize that at about the same time, and we just look at each other. Then the ringing got louder and faster, so much so that people were turning their porch lights on to figure out what was going on. I've never ran so fast in my life. We spent a lot of time in the graveyard together. That was our place to go and get away from everything for a while. A few days after this occurred, we started paying more attention to the graveyard when we came through, and noticed a bell at the foot of a grave. Knowing that people were buried alive sometimes, and that the bell was meant to be rung if you were falsely pronounced dead, it was the first thing that came to my mind. It also could have very well been someone messing with us, but something in my gut tells me that's not the case. So like 3 years ago, my mom worked for this lady who lived out of state, but owned a very beautiful historic house, about 3 blocks away from my mom's house. So of course she was happy to work there. She could just walk down the street and be at work, which also meant she could be there quickly if there was an emergency. She had no supervision because she was there by herself 99% of the time, checking in people, cleaning, cooking for the guests, doing laundry for them, etc. A woman and her daughter, I think it was her daughter, checked into the B&B, and while my mom was checking them in, the girl had this odd look about her, and I distinctly remember thinking to myself, man, this kid looks like she's seeing things that aren't there. Which was weird, because after my mom checked them in and was showing them to their room upstairs, the little girl asked my mom, "Who are all those people?" Mom says, "Who?" She says, "All those people following you." I'm pretty skeptical when it comes to the supernatural, but this genuinely freaked me the fuck out. Most of all because everyone I know who was ever in that bed and breakfast, including myself, agrees that it has a very unsettling vibe. Like you're being watched. I'm actually getting chills thinking about it. The whole place just gives us the willies. And don't even get me started on the basement. Creepiest place I've ever been. And it was huge. Like something out of a horror game. I was probably around 20, and I was babysitting for some decently wealthy people who happened to be good friends of mine. I was on the main floor. There was one little boy upstairs in bed, and 4 older boys between 8 and 9 downstairs playing video games. It was probably close to 11 p.m., and there's a knock at the door. I can see it's a big guy in a red sweatshirt. I slowly crawl to the kitchen and grab the biggest knife I can find, and go stand at the wall by the door, where the man cannot see me, but would have to walk past me to come in. I called the homeowner because they have that Ring doorbell, and this was when it was very new and few people had it, so she can talk to the man through their phone. So she says, "I'll call you right back after I talk to him," and hangs up. Meanwhile, the guy is knocking aggressively now, and I'm praying none of the kids hear, as I don't want them to come upstairs or downstairs and scare them. My phone rings and she says that she talked to him, and he said he was with Uber, not popular in this area at this time, looking for Angela, which ironically happens to be the homeowner, my friend's name, but the last name was something weird. She said she told him he had the wrong address and to be on his way. However, he is still at the door. She stays on the phone with me until he walks away, which was several minutes later. We hang up as she thinks it was an honest misunderstanding. Meanwhile, I have this terrible, awful feeling in my gut. So I go to the door to watch for his headlights to leave. Their house is at the end of a dead-end road. I never saw his headlights leave, nor did I ever see a car. I laid on the couch staring at the door until daylight at 7 a.m., when I finally fell asleep, only to be awoken by the kids at 8 a.m. The whole time this big man was standing at the door, all I could think to myself was, I'm a 20-year-old, 100-pound, 5'3" female. You have to kill him. If he comes through that door, you have to give it your everything and kill him. You have to protect these 5 little boys. You have to stab him and don't stop. It's honestly a scary way to think, but the motherly instinct in me was telling me I have to save the kids at all costs. Thankfully, he never came back that night, and I didn't have to test my strength. My grandmother told me a story when I was a kid that has stuck with me to this day. We were in her room one night, and we were watching a scary movie, or a true crime show, I can't remember which, when she proceeded to tell me about the time she was stranded late at night with a killer on the loose. I stopped watching the TV, turned around and said, "What? Are you serious?" She said, "Of course I am." Now, how I remember it was it took place on a night in the late 70s, either 78 or 79. It happened here in Las Vegas. She got up at 1 a.m. to get ready for work. She was a cocktail waitress at the Riviera at the time. She finished getting ready. hopped in the car, and started heading to work. Now, this is the late 70s. There weren't a lot of people out and about on the streets at 2-something in the morning, especially in the neighborhood surrounding the Strip. So she's on her way, and just then her car starts puttering and then comes to a complete stop and breaks down on a street named Mountain Vista. It's a street that slopes down a hill, and her car broke down at the top of it. Now, at the time, there was hardly anything around this area, except a high school down the street to the right, and a Circle K at the bottom of the hill. She said it was a cool and very quiet night, and when her car stopped and wouldn't start again, she got very afraid. There had been a few girls around the area that had gone missing, and some had turned up dead. There was a killer on the loose, and nobody knew who he was or where he was. So after a few minutes, she got out of her car and walked down the hill to the Circle K to use the payphone to call my grandfather to pick her up. She was about halfway down the hill when she heard a twig snap. She turned around and saw a man standing near her car, staring at her. She couldn't make out his face. It was too dark, and there weren't a lot of streetlights on that road. Well, she was panicked at this point. This guy came out of nowhere, so she turned around and started walking a little faster down the hill. But after a couple of minutes, she thought she heard footsteps in the distance. She turned around again and saw the man wasn't standing by the car anymore. He was running, and he was running towards her. She said she felt like her heart stopped. Terrified, she turned around and started running to the Circle K. She said it felt like she was running forever, and she could hear him getting closer and closer. She was getting tired, but she knew she had to keep running, running for her life, running for her 2 young daughters. She couldn't give up. She could hear the man laughing now, and it sounded like he was almost on top of her. She got to the bottom of the hill and stepped foot in the brightly lit parking lot of the Circle K. She turned the corner, opened the door, and screamed to the attendant for help. She could barely breathe at this point. She was able to get out that the man was chasing her down the hill and to call the police. She used the payphone in the corner of the room to call my grandpa to pick her up, and the attendant went outside to see what was going on because he didn't see anybody behind her when she ran in. The attendant turned the corner, and no one was there. He went to the sidewalk to look up the hill, and he could see a shadowy figure running back up the hill. My grandmother waited inside for my grandfather, and she was safe. We'll never know what could have happened that night if she hadn't been fast enough, and we don't know if that man on the hill was the same man who killed those girls. But I think it's safe to say it wouldn't have ended well that night for my grandmother. Thank you for listening. Please hit that like button and subscribe. Until next time.